Hello and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, Luca Parry, and today it's my delight to be joined by David Price. David Price, OBE, is an expert in organizational learning for our complex future. He writes, talks, trains, and advises around the world on some of the biggest challenges facing business, education, and society. Solving the problems of employee, student, and civic disengagement, maximizing our potential to be creative, innovative, and fulfilled citizens, and understanding the global shift towards open organizations and systems of learning. His first book, Open: How We'll Work, Live, and Learn in the Future, has been an Amazon bestseller since its publication, with 40,000 sold copies. Goodreaders voted it the most influential book on education in 2016. And his recently published new book is The Power of Us: How We Connect, Act, and Innovate. The 3 years of research writing involved interviews with leaders of organizations across the United Kingdom, the USA, Cambodia, Australia, and Malaysia. And in 2009, David was awarded the OBE by Her Majesty the Queen for services to education. David, thank you for joining us for this conversation.
It's great to be here.
Let's start with the first question. As someone that's spent your life in learning, I'm curious about this. What's something you've learnt recently?
Yeah, I guess whether I learned it from scratch or whether it was just a realization, but I was speaking at a conference last week. It was the first one since lockdown started. And I just happened to be sitting in another session, and the person who was leading the session asked how many people were currently not in the office. It was a conference of internal communicators. And every hand went up, maybe a couple. Then someone said, how many of you would prefer to be in the office? And virtually no hands went up. And it struck me that this notion of the hybrid workplace is going to last much longer than the pandemic. You know, I think it could be a permanent shift. And I think that for people like ourselves, look, that does have implications, because as much as I love being in spaces with people, I have to recognize that what we are doing now is you know, it has already become the standard. And I think people have seen it as it's just a phase that we'll go through, and eventually the Zoom fatigue will end. Well, it won't, I think. You know, I do think there will be times when some businesses will have to say, we need people in the office. I interviewed a CEO from a creative ad agency, and he said, you know, you can't really do ideation sessions over Zoom. You've got to have people in the room. So I think there are some areas of work where that would be a necessity. But I think the reality has been that leaders know that they're not really in charge anymore. Their people are. And that's been a huge shift. And I don't think it's fully dawned on some leaders.
Yeah, that's a great place to launch off from. I mean, this idea of agency, choice, hybridization, you know, the Scott Galloway concept of, you know, the crisis has done many things, but more than anything, it's been an accelerant. It's added this kind of fuel, you know, and catalyzed
Absolutely.
decades of change in weeks, in some cases, in some industries. So take us, and I mean, you're very much a deep generalist in my eyes, David. So take us into some of the big ideas, plural, that you've really been exploring through your work, be it open and the idea of, you know, the emerging future of workplaces and of schools, or also into the power of us. You know, how do we, right at this moment, realize that we're all in this together and then innovate forward?
Well, I suppose I'm at that point in my life where, you know, I should have retired, but I'm never going to. But you do tend to look back and think, well, how did I get here? How did I get to this point? Because like everyone else during the pandemic, you know, you go through those periods of introspection and you think, what do I want to do now? You know, with whatever years are left remaining. And as you know, my heart's always been in education. It's where I spent most of my working life. But when I was doing the research for Open, I was very clear about the fact that for me, it didn't matter whether learning was taking place in an office, in a training room, in a cooperative or in a school or college. The issues were the same. And a number of people said, you're nuts. You need to either write a book about education or you need to write a book about learning in the workplace, but you can't combine them. And I did. For me, that it opened up a whole other world and put me in contact with all sorts of people that I probably would never have met had I just stayed in education. Now, does this mean that I'm going to stop working with teachers? Absolutely not. But I do think that it benefits me enormously to, as you describe me as a deep generalist, that's a pretty good description. I think, my natural curiosity has taken me into all kinds of areas, and at some point somebody will have to tell me how to write a book, because I had no idea what I was doing when I wrote Open. And I thought after that, it was a bit like when I used to be in a band and you'd put the first album out and then you think, oh, what are we going to do with the second album? And people are saying, so what are you working on now for your next book? And the truth was, I had no idea. But there was just something. In hindsight, it's easy to see the connections, because Open was about how knowledge is being shared. It was inevitable that, 6 years later, we were going to have gone to the next stage. I just didn't realize at the time, which is, what do you do with that knowledge? But I started to see groups of people who would by no means be classed as experts, but they started to make things and to share things. And that whole artisanal economy was really just starting to happen. Now, the pandemic has accelerated that massively. Thank goodness I'd already kind of written most of the book when the pandemic happened, because it merely underlined some of the theories that I was advocating, which was, people, there is a wave of mass ingenuity which is taking place. It was happening anyway before the pandemic. Previously, the two things that used to stop people from producing and making things was the access to the means of production. Well, laser 3D laser printers are what, at $400. So that's no longer a problem. And then access to capital. And you've now got peer-to-peer lending services. So that's no longer the kind of problem. What I was speculating in the book before the pandemic hit was, if we went from sharing what we knew to share what we own to now sharing what we make, is there a further step, which is sharing what we make at scale? Because what I saw was a bunch of hobbyists who largely were happy to just keep it within their circle. But with the pandemic, there was a new sense of urgency. And, in this country, we had 1,000 Facebook self-help groups sprung up within 2 weeks of lockdown. You had kids in school making 3D face shields. You had people making scrubs for hospital workers when our government was signally failing. We'd ordered $750 million worth of out-of-date PPE from Turkey. It was 10 years out of date, completely unusable. So the phrase I use in the book is communities are outperforming bureaucracies. And I really believe that's true.
Interesting.
So the question is, what do we do with that as individuals and as organizations?
Wow. Well, let's take it at the organizational level first and then go backwards, because I'm fascinated, as you would not be surprised, by concepts like New Power by Jeremy Hammonds and Henry Timms, for example, by Frederic Laloux, or reinventing organizations and the level of consciousness that exists. How do we move towards holacracy and these ideas of the ecology as the major driving metaphor, as opposed to the mechanisms or the hierarchical pieces? And you write about this in the book. So what is it about organizations that, the community outperforms the bureaucracy, also might outperform hierarchies? So take us into that world a little bit more. What do you see is not just the emerging future, but perhaps the preferred future for the way that organizations, including schools, are structured and function?
Yeah, and I think perhaps education is one of the areas that is maybe not responding in the way, well, certainly from the perspective of the UK, in the way that one would hope. I think those drastic changes and for me, the driver behind all of this is the idea of self-determination, that we want to have more control. I think self-determination is what's driven things like the Scottish push for independence, the breakup of large states, but it also applies to our working environment. It applies to how we choose to learn, and so I think organizations have got to recognize that you can no longer just tell people what to do. And that's what I mean about you're not in charge anymore as a leader. Your people are, because and now it's particularly true because we've got this massive labor shortage in all areas. And so the question is, if you're going to try and get good people to come and work for you, then it's no longer enough to just say we'll pay you a ton of money. You've got to give them more work-life balance. And fortunately, one of the things about the pandemic, we did a survey of CEOs' attitudes and what they had learned. And the thing that was coming out over and over again was the idea of well-being and mental health and just reconnecting people. And I think that's the challenge now for organizations. That's on one level, if you like. That's within your organization. How do you get the best out of people? For years, Luca, like you, I was doing, innovation, creativity workshops, because somebody would bring you in and say, can you sprinkle a bit of fairy dust on these people and make them more creative? I eventually realized that wasn't the issue. People aren't just naturally creative. If they're working in a culture which prevents that, then it doesn't matter how many workshops you attend. You're not going to feel that you want to be creative or innovative. So I think organizations have really got to take culture seriously now and making sure that they've got the right kind of culture. On the other side of it is these other people who both buy their products but also make their own, or they hack the products that belong to these companies. And for too long, I think companies have just ignored them. And, you've ended up in a situation where, a 17-year-old kid has created the COVID tracking website in the US.
That's right.
And when the government failed to do so. But what's interesting, of course, given our work, is that he was unable, he thought he'd be unable to get into college because his grade point average was so low. It was 1.7, I think. And I kept in touch with Abby Schiffman, who, he'd won the Webby Person of the Year. It's like the Oscars if you're and I just said to him, Avi, you don't want to be in a college that doesn't recognize what you've done outside of school. Fortunately, Harvard took him, so he's happy. But what I thought was interesting was that he was offered, I think it was $80 million to sell that website for commercial purposes, and he said no, because you'll fill it up with ads, and this is too important. And I think our young people are driven by other forces than perhaps my generation was, and so that's a lot of learning to take on board. Plus, it seems to me, CEOs have also now got the whole phenomenon of the social movement, the rise in social movements. Of course, we've always had social movements. We've just not had as many, nor have they been as successful, because they're now networked. The two largest public demonstrations the world has ever seen were organized by a bunch of school kids. How does that happen? And yet we can't trust kids to help us redesign the curriculum. They can organize, Greta Thunberg's crew can organize these incredible marches. So it just seems to me we've got to recognize at all levels of society that self-determination, autonomy is how you get the best out of people.
That's fantastic, David. And I think it really speaks to what we're supposedly seeing now, this great resignation, which of course, if you're in the company space, it's called the great attrition, the great resignation, because you're losing stuff. And so this piece on culture, I mean, I think you put it so beautifully. You can have every strategy in the world. You can have all the kind of innovation, processes, but unless it's supported in the culture. So my next question to you is really one on leadership before we kind of delve into the individual level. Well, it is the individual level in some ways. How how do leaders enable the kind of evolution or even transcendence, perhaps, of on that cultural journey of their organizations? How do you actually move from, command and control, hierarchical, to organic swarm holocracy? I mean, how does that journey take place? What words would you share for leaders that are on this journey right now? Motivation design, for example, self-determination, agency, belonging, engagement, all these kind of pieces that Dan Pink spoke about, a while ago, basically rebranding self-determination theory. What's the path forward? What have you seen across your work?
Well, I think it's been no coincidence to me that the organizations that responded with the greatest agility during the pandemic and were able to just turn on a sixpence to shift what they were making, whether that was, stuff which was related to the pandemic, or whether it was just that they found a different way to work. But they were the leaders who had a greater sense of this notion of servant leadership. I don't think that really covers it, that phrase, but it starts to get to the heart of it. And I think leaders will have no choice soon, that if they want to survive as business. I'll give you an example. Friend of mine, his wife works in a bank. I won't name the bank, but it's a very large bank, and they made a couple of appointments. They were executives, and they did it during lockdown, so they weren't able to actually meet them. The whole thing was done remotely. But these were not, office juniors. These were senior roles. And after the first day, both of these executives resigned. And they said, well, what did we do wrong? It's only day one. And they said, well, nothing much really, but, we don't really believe in your values too much. And there's plenty of other places that'll have us. So we're off. Bye. Now, that was a shock to the system, and the resignation wave is real. It's been running in the US at 4 million resignations a month since April. So that's what, 25 million resignations. That's a huge number. In the UK, they did a study over the summer. 75% of all adults in the UK were either thinking of moving house, leaving the partner, or quitting the job. So these are colossal numbers that we've just never experienced before. So to a certain extent, there'll be kind of an attrition of the leadership. But I do think that for the others, and intentionality is key here. I've worked with a CEO recently. He read the book, and he rang me up one day, and I could see he was at his wit's end, and he just said, I don't think I'm a bad person, but I can't get people on my side. They don't seem to want to work with any great enthusiasm. What they do is actually an artisanal craft, beautiful. They make beautiful things, and we work together. And he had to face really difficult realizations, and he had to be brave. He wasn't trusting them. He had locks on the cupboards where the tools were kept. He was making people, clock in and clock out, all of the things that signal an absence of trust. And he took a conscious decision that things would have to change, and he would have to change. And it's fantastic to see the change in him. We've developed this cultural audit process, and his organization has been one of our beta testers. And they've come out with some of the highest scores, and it's really great to see. But not only are their people happier, he's happier, but they've got full order books now until the end of 2023. So, it doesn't come at the expense of success. I think it's a prerequisite. Sorry, I just want to say one other thing.
Yes, go ahead.
It's fresh in my mind. Part of that has been that this talk I gave last week, I was urging these people in internal comms to think how they could create a social movement within their own workplace. And I said, think about how Black Lives Matter got their message across. Think about how people like Nike were so keen to work with them. but also think about what happens when you get that wrong. And some of the organizations that have got that wrong, it's been absolutely disastrous. Brewdog would be one of them, because they were building a social movement. You know, I was one of 200,000 equity pumps. Well, I still am. But Brewdog is a craft brewery, for those who don't know, in Scotland. They've now got a brewery in Brisbane. And there was a big scandal because it turned out that the leader, James Watt, who I interviewed for the book, was taken by surprise because he got the thing that, you know, it strikes fear into the hearts of CEOs everywhere, an open letter from disgruntled employees. And it was quite damning. You know, it described this toxic culture, misogyny. And I still don't think they've repaired that damage. But that came about, it seemed to me, because he thought he knew what the culture was. He describes himself as the captain of the ship. Well, you know, that's still part of that ego-driven. And he's that curious mix of he's trying to save the planet, you know, the carbon negative as an organization. He's doing a lot of the right things, but he was telling me how great their culture was. And yet all the while, he wasn't aware that this was going on. So those kinds of slaps in the face for CEOs are happening on a daily basis. I had another guy that I spoke to, a CEO, and I interviewed him and I said, would you imagine 10 years ago that you would need to have a position on, say, transgender rights? And he laughed and he said, well, of course not. He said, but more than that, he said, if anybody had asked me, I'd have said, it's none of my business. But it's everybody's business now. And people will only go and work for you as a leader if they know what you stand for. And so that division between, you know, the corporate world and the political world, it's kind of crumbling.
That's fascinating, David. The piece you talked about social movements actually resonates really well with a former guest, Santiago Gallardo Rincon. He talked about education as a social movement. And how do you think about change in those terms, almost in a Paulo Freire type of approach? But I'm really interested in in terms of, you know, this idea of we're all, I think it's Gandhi, of course, but, you know, we're all out there trying to change the world, but we must start by changing ourselves. And I think this is separation that we have between what we do outside and inside. You know, our internal worlds, our ability to emotionally regulate. You know, a lot of my work is around social and emotional constructs and dimensions, how we elevate those alongside the academics, you know, as the future of work, future of learning. You know, I'd love your reflections on how do we take this into a learning organization as well. I mean, we could make the claim that every company now is a learning organization. In terms of a school, you know, how do we restructure, like where are you seeing the emergent mainstream of education? Because K to 12, you know, there are a million pundits out there that would say education is broken. Now, I don't think that necessarily solves anything. So yeah, what's your reflections on that?
Yeah, well, wow, there's so much in what you've said there. Because what came to mind as you were describing that dislocations between the internal and the external. We've just been working on a series, we being the Power of Us agency, the six of us, and one of the people that I'm co-writing a toolkit based upon the book, because people kept saying to me, you know, this is great, but how do I do this practically?
Give us the steps, yeah.
So we started looking at, you know, what are the kinds of processes and activities that we need to put in this toolkit. And one of our group is an executive coach, and there were so many activities that he was suggesting that I found myself one day saying, oh, this is a bit hippy dippy, isn't it? You know, and then I realized the more we got into it, that actually, as we say in the toolkit, before there is you, there is us, and putting yourself out of that picture, to be saying, how can I be my authentic self in work, and is that going to be enough for people? In my view, it's always enough, because if you're not your authentic self, they're going to see through you anyway. Yeah. So I think that goes to I guess education in so far as the schools that I am most heartened by and feel, yeah, it's not It's not completely broken, the system. But they're ones who are having to work within the system, but they don't make that stop them doing the things that they came into the job for. So XP School in Doncaster is a case in point. A lot of these new schools are run by tech startup people. And I think they bring a lot of that mentality, including holacracy. You know, I mean, when you think about it, schools are some of the most hierarchical places in the world.
Absolutely.
So when Gwyn Apari set up XP, he just said, you know, we have total control of our budgets. We can do what we like. The timetable is not something that's handed down to us. We create our own. So they took a number of decisions. Like there would be, I think they've got maybe 3 layers of management within that school. They've never paid for an hour of cover.
Yes,
because
relief
they
teaching,
just say,
emergency teaching.
yeah. They say we can use that money on stuff with the kids, and so they cover for one another. But the most striking signal that it sends out is they changed their school motto to one, and I love this. And when you walk into the school, you see this thing in big letters: above all, compassion. And I think that's so great. You know, we've got so many schools that put out these ridiculous Ofsted banners, you know, we're an outstanding school or we're a good school. You never see one saying we're a school in special measures. They kind of bury that. But the Ofsted label becomes this yoke around people's neck. And actually, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything to parents. Shouldn't, but sadly it does. But you know, as long as your kid's being looked after with love and care and attention, then that seems to me to be a big thing. And yes, of course, they've got to be learning, but what XP says, we have to learn purposefully. We have to do things that matter in the world, you know, and it's based upon Ron Berger's expeditionary learning model. Yes. And they're just wonderful balances, I think, of the necessary within the structure. Until we can change the structure, which is, you know, I think what Learning Creates is trying to do in Australia, and things like the Mastery Transcript Initiative are trying to do in the US. Until we can change that structure, we've got to live with it. But I believe it calls now, particularly coming out of lockdown, when there just seems to be this desire to, let's just go back to normal. Let's just go back to how it used to be. I think it calls for courage from leaders who are going to say, no, we're not. You know, Rahm Emanuel is always quoted with that famous line that he said after the financial crash when he was the Treasury Secretary of State for Obama. And he said, never let a good crisis go to waste. But what he also said was, because it allows us to do things we never thought we could do before. That's the bit that never gets quoted. Yes. And that to me is what has happened in this pandemic with schools. They never thought they could make that switch to hybrid learning so quickly. But there was lots of other things that happened. And I think what I see in this country, and I have seen in other countries, is that there's almost a sense of, when we get the old framework back in, and when we're all sitting these kids down for, 3-hour exams, then everything will be back to how it used to be. Well, how it used to be wasn't great for the majority of kids. So why are we aspiring to do that?
David, fantastic pieces to pick up there as well. I'd love your commentary on kind of the idea of meritocracy, or maybe the idea that we've internalized individualism to such an extent that we almost have to unlearn that and come back to this collective. I think First Nations, particularly here in Australia, can teach us a lot about this is the power of us. I am because we are Ubuntu, the African, concept. So yeah, there's that piece that, not just self-actualization and growth mindset, but self-transcendence and compassion mindset, if we take the XP, because compassion forces us to think about us, that we are in this together. What's your reflection on how we overcome the fact that we have schools that are still articulating a type of success that I think in our collective view, certainly in mine, is no longer fit for purpose. And, we've had Valerie Hannon on this podcast previously as well, a colleague of yours. And again, she's like, what is the school for? Is a pretty good question to ask, particularly post a crisis that expands the Overton window of what is conceived as possible to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really, it's a really pivotal moment. I could probably best describe it by saying I was doing a consultancy with a school in Australia. I won't say who they are, but they're a very, very high performing school. And they tried to introduce an experiment of no grades, just verbal feedback. And it was the parents who said, no, we can't have that. And when they asked why, the parents said, because for there to be winners, there have to be losers. I found that incredibly dispiriting thing to say, and contrast that with the expeditionary learning schools that we just mentioned, where they say to all their kids on the first day they turn up at that school, your job is not to get into college. Your job is to get everybody in this room into college. And that's a different way of flipping that model. The reality is, it seems to me, in purely, output terms, these are successful schools and compassionate schools. So it isn't an either or. And I think that we allow ourselves to be tricked into that. But what does it mean? I think it's much bigger, than schools and education. It's a societal thing. And we weren't all in this together during the pandemic. And we might have said that, where I think it was striking, and I said this last week when I gave a presentation, is even the Second World War, there were some parts of the world that it didn't really affect. But, with the exception of a couple of tiny Pacific islands, everyone in the world has been affected by that. So in that sense, yes, we are in it. But of course, some of us have got a boat with leaks in it, and others have got a perfectly, serviceable yacht.
Yeah.
So will this be a moment of reckoning for our societies? I would love to think so, but we get into a much bigger conversation about what that means, because Valerie's question is very pertinent, but the answer currently, it seems to me, is that it is still preparing kids for an industrial world which doesn't even exist anymore. So it's in that sense, the old routine is not fit for purpose, but can it be changed? That's do we as individuals have the wherewithal to change it? The way this was graphically driven home to me was, I did some work in a friend of mine set up some schools in India, in New Delhi, and they're an attempt to be progressive schools in a very, very traditional system. And me and my wife do these parental engagement workshops, and we get parents to be thinking about learning theories, frankly. Things that schools often say, oh, parents aren't interested in that. No, that's not true. They are interested. They just never get a chance to do it. At the end of this session, this guy came up to me and he said, that was really great. I really enjoyed everything you said. He said, and I work as head of HR for Google in India. He said, so I totally get it that we can't get people with the kind of skills, with the empathy, with the kind of leadership and collaborative skills that we need. But I came up through the traditional system and it worked very well for me. And frankly, that's what most of our politicians have experienced, and it's served them perfectly well. So how do we shift that mindset so that we're thinking about what is best for us as a society? And that would require our addiction to growth to come to an end. And who knows, maybe after COP26 we'll realize that there's more important things to life than profit. But I do think that it is driven by that. So those structures that we see in most industrialized societies, those educational structures, they're there for a reason, and it's to sort out the sheep from the goats and to say who's going to go to the posh universities and who's not. And so we have to tackle the whole system, which is kind of overwhelming for teachers. I get that.
Yes. Yeah, I get this sense, David. I'd love just to ask your wisdom on this, because I feel there is a, even in my own journey as an educator, and many colleagues with whom I've worked, there is this sense over time of a fading agency, or almost a learned helplessness. And I wonder if it's, again, it's the features of the system that we've all inherited from that past paradigm. Like then you have to ask, well, what is a system? And then you have go down that road. So there's, and yet, when you talk about these lighthouses of practice, the lighthouse is out in the elements. It's getting battered by the wind. It's there to show us the way. But it's hard to be a lighthouse, I think. So how do we all understand our own agency to be agents of change? Because I do wonder about the leaders that are doing this within the system, within the constraints, but finding a way forward all the same. And they realize that they are effectively the system itself, observing and reinforcing itself. And so if we all change our practice, and this is what we saw the system change because we all went to hybrid learning because it was emergency teaching, we had to. And so we saw that lasting change. It wasn't an externally driven initiative or digital transformation project. It was just required. And teachers, I think, did phenomenally well under the circumstances. What reflections do you have? You've been doing this work for a long time. This seems to be a mindset question to me. Like, how do we actually create or enable the emergence of an abundance mindset as opposed to that scarcity mindset?
Yeah. Let me come at it from a slightly different angle, Luca, because one of the things that I say when I'm giving talks, and I'm talking about the power of us and this drive to organize, and I sometimes give quite frivolous, what could be seen as frivolous examples. So let's take IKEA hackers. Have you come across IKEA hackers?
No, tell me more.
Not many people have. But actually, it's at least 100,000 people in various parts of the world. But it was set up by a Malaysian woman. And the concept is, instead of following those instructions that IKEA spend a fortune making sure that, they fail safe, and you're going to be able to assemble it, and one piece of IKEA furniture is going to look identical. Well, these people just throw all that away and they say, well, what can we do with this? And then they take photographs and they put it up and they show their designs and they share it. Well, IKEA got to hear about this and sent them a cease and desist letter and said, you can't do this. And they said, why?
You're kidding.
They said, well, because we spend a lot of money making sure that it's assembled in the correct way. And now you're messing that up. So they said, okay, but they said, bear in mind that we could do this with anybody's furniture. So do you want us to go to one of your rivals? Fortunately, they had a pause and came back to them and said, okay, we won't send you the cease and desist letter, but maybe we'll allow you to do this, and maybe we'll give you a little part of our website where you crazy people can do all this. And they've now brought out their first range of IKEA hackable furniture. So
interesting.
what I say to people is, when it comes to the thing that I kind of call people-powered innovation, you've got a number of choices as a whether it's an organization or a government. You can recognize it and try and work with it. That's my preferred option. You can try and stop it, like IKEA tried to do, but you're just shooting yourself in the foot, because these people will not be stopped. Biohackers are perfectly prepared to risk their life changing the DNA and then, video the whole thing and put it up on YouTube. So a government edict isn't going to stop that. Yeah. Or you can try and ignore it. And that's what a lot of people do. And that's fatal, because these people are not going to go away. And there are times I wonder, during the pandemic, there was a massive upsurge again in homeschooling. But I think all of the things that you talked about, that as bureaucracies we responded to, like developing the technology, so did the homeschoolers. So did the kids in tutoria all around the world who are doing peer-to-peer learning at scale. So the young people themselves are getting much cleverer at this and much better networked. So pretty soon, and I would speculate within maybe a decade, I think we will see, and it'll be fascinating to see this happen, we will see some young people who say, actually, you don't need to go to school, because we as a self-help community, we can learn from each other. And there's a school that I work with. I ran a project called Learning Futures ages ago, about 12 years ago, and they are a kind of hybrid model where the local school said to the homeschoolers, why don't we put you on our rolls, so that then we get the money, which we'll give to you. All you have to do is come in occasionally and we'll do some stuff together, but by and large we'll give you some premises and you can continue to do the homeschooling. And it's a classic case of the power of us, even though it's 15 years old. But I think we'll start seeing more of that. So you could say then, are we just going to ignore that growing movement of people? I think it would be a really big mistake. I certainly don't think you can try and legislate it out of existence, but I don't think it would work. So my hope is that our governments and the bureaucracies are not so inured to these changes that are going on that they don't want to have a conversation about it. And we see this in some of the more, I think, sophisticated countries, where they say, let's get a diversity of models, because there isn't just one size fits all, fits nobody. One of the schools that I write about in the book is New Road School in Santa Monica, which for an independent school is remarkable, because it gives away almost 40% of its fee income to enable kids from Compton and Watts and the really deprived parts of California to come to the school, one of whom happened to be Amanda Gorman, so produced that incredible talent. And it's a wonderful school. You would love it, Luca, because it's the kind of school where you go to find out who you are as a person. And as a result, it gets this amazing mix of kids who are on the spectrum. I think 40% of the kids have got some form of autism. It has film directors, kids. The Steven Spielberg Theatre is there because Spielberg sent his kids there. But it's also got kids who are going home and are experiencing food poverty. And it has built this petri dish of what the American experiment was supposed to be about. Can we all get along? And can schools become the communities? And that, to me, brings us back to the pandemic, because I think there is an opportunity. When I'm in my more optimistic frame of mind, I think it's an opportunity for schools to help redefine themselves by becoming the centers of a rejuvenated community. And I know you guys have had a very different pandemic experience in some ways, although you still have suffered job losses and some of the problems that we got in this country. But we've got over here, we've got inner city areas that are just desperate. Everything's closed down, and it's going to take a lot of fixing. And I just think this is the moment. This is the moment for schools to step up and say, we don't need to just go begging to the government. There are things that we could do. We don't have to allow the local government, to close the library because they've got no money. We could do it. We could run it on a volunteer basis. I just think this is a great opportunity for schools to say, we are relevant still because we are at the heart of our community.
Yeah.
It's a big shift, but
David,
it's possible.
You said something then about New Road School, talking about this is the place you go to find out who you really are.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty good articulation of what a school might be for, is,
Exactly.
rather than here's what you know and here's what you need to do with what you know, and I mean, I support that, experiential learning, but this piece around identity, I think, or core capabilities, which serve us through life, and actually we attach to, and our ability to let go of a previous state and then transition into another one. The idea of workforce shift example, and some of the Foundation for Young Australians work, that's been done down here. I have two final questions for you. I mean, I've got about 20, but I'll stick to two. The first is, if we're having this conversation in 10 years' time, you've spoken a bit about this, what you call people-powered innovation, and the idea of collectives and these new models that are emergent, which in some ways is invention, but also remembering, coming back to perhaps before we got lost. What do you think the major trends and themes will be if we're having this conversation in 10 years' time? And perhaps we've got the optimistic Luca and David here. We've seen some kind of significant shifts, not just in the school structure, but actually in societal structure, and perhaps even ontology, like what the values of a society might be.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. Well, the first thing to say is, if we're having this conversation in 10 years' time, I'll be very happy, because that means I'm still here. So that's the first thing. The second, though, I think is, if we're having this conversation in 10 years' time and we really have done nothing about the climate emergency, then we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. And we are leaving, at times I find it incredible that the crisis of self-harm and attempted suicide that we're seeing in our young people around the world is not being addressed. It's not being taken seriously. In July, my wife and I, we had a little break. We were allowed, it was during the periods between two lockdowns, and we went up and stayed at a really nice pub in North Yorkshire. And the following morning we came out, and we came across a young girl trying to hang herself, and it was really distressing. And we talked around, and we spent the day with her, really. But what was really striking, Luca, is that when I came home, I started telling a few friends, and they'd all had a similar kind of experience. There was a young person that was trying to throw themselves off a bridge or something. And we really have to take this seriously, because they're not stupid. They look at the way the climate is going down the Swanee, and they just think, well, what kind of future am I going to have? And even if the climate is okay, then what will it mean in terms of, job security, pension, all the things that, my generation took for granted. And I said, I think in open, that, my generation had the party, and these young people have got the hangover. And I'm in awe of their ability to be without rancor and to be without resentment. And I am also in awe of their capacity for innovation and what I would call social enterprise. One of the things about writing the book means that these young people kind of make themselves known to me. And I came across a girl in Bogota, she's 15, called Sofia Leal, and she's doing some amazing things. She has built this emergency housing. It's like an igloo, but it's made of carbon fiber, which can house a family of 4 during a natural disaster. And she's now taking this to production stage. She's won a national university competition in Colombia. And it used to be that they were the exceptions, these kids, but I see so many of them now, and I'm sure you do in your work.
Yes.
I just think if in 10 years' time we're having this conversation, I would hope that we're saying, when we got out of their way and just let them determine what kind of world they wanted, and actually trusted their good judgment and trusted their high moral values, that was the best thing we did. But so long as we keep them kind of tied down and tethered down, then things aren't going to end well.
Yeah.
That's a very pessimistic note to end on, because I do think that actually what they will do is they will create their own democratic system. I firmly believe that will happen. They don't believe, and I don't blame them, they don't believe in the current system of representative democracy. And all they need now is, and there's some people like Don Tapscott who's putting money in to help them do this, but all they really need is a forum where they can come and reinvent how the democratic system should be. And I don't think that's too far away. And when that happens, then, they'll be like those communities in Quartzsite, who just set up camp and they just create their own society. And I wouldn't blame them for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I
that's
want
right.
to join them. I want to go there. You know,
With
I'm the guy who always wants to go up to Findhorn in Scotland. You know, we used to laugh at those people because they were saying that, you know, we're trashing the earth and we've got to set up our own community. Now we look at them and they're the smart guys.
Yeah. It's funny. It's, you know, when you think about what Burning Man has done for festivals and what blockchain has done for financial markets, you know, you wonder about what's the kind of humanics, what's the human blockchain that can, upon which things can be built. I'm just
Well, I can give you a
fascinating.
very specific example. I know we're running out of time, but let me just
That's all right, yeah.
quickly, because it's featured in the book. One of the organizations that I feature is called Repowering, and they're based in London, but they are now actually working in other countries. But they are a kind of community, they're a cooperative, not for profit, there's community energy generation initiative. And it's a beautiful circular model. So they go into these deprived, what Americans would call social projects. We call them council house estates or blocks of apartments. And they teach young people how to build solar panels. And then they put the solar panels up on the roofs of these houses, which then generates the electricity. So they become self-sufficient in terms of
Fantastic.
energy, but they're also training these young people to have the skills. But here's the thing, a number of these young people said, well, this isn't enough. This is good, but it's not enough, because I've got a cousin who's like 4 miles away. If I produce excess energy, if I'm in surplus, why can't I gift my energy to them? And so they're now working with a couple of universities. They're using blockchain technology to create the world's first peer-to-peer energy trading platform.
Nice.
That's what I mean about the power of us.
That's fantastic. Oh, David, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you, and we've covered some ground,
Yes,
which has been a delight as well. I would love you to leave us with some parting words. What's a take-home message that you want to share with our listener community?
Oh wow. Well, for educators, I think we have to recognize that what might have worked for us, although frankly I'm not one of those people, I hated school with a passion, but what worked for a lot of us doesn't necessarily work for the world as it is now, and that we need some bravery, we need compassion. The next 10 years are going to be difficult, and if we judge it purely on, you know, the old metrics, we will have missed a great opportunity. We've got an opportunity now to create some new metrics. What really matters when it comes to valuing our young people's talents and creativity and character? What really matters? And now's the opportunity. We will never get a better opportunity than this time now, because once things do start to go back to some level of how they were, then we'll just go back to the same old. So let's seize the day.
David Price, a delight to have you on the Learning Future podcast. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation. Great way to start my day and end yours.
Fantastic.